Francis I ascended the French throne in 1515 at the age of 20, inheriting a kingdom that had been shaped by centuries of dynastic ambition, war, and political intrigue. Born in 1494, he was the son of Charles, Count of Angoulême, and Louise of Savoy, a woman whose intellect and political acumen would leave a lasting impression on him. From an early age, Francis demonstrated a combination of charm, ambition, and energy that would define his reign. France, during his accession, was emerging from the shadow of the medieval period and entering the vibrant cultural awakening that historians would later call the Renaissance. Francis embraced this shift with a fervor that extended from politics to art, from war to love, creating a legacy that was as much about personality as governance. Francis was determined to assert his authority and establish his personal power as king. His early reign was immediately marked by military ambition. At just 21, he led his troops to victory at the Battle of Marignano in 1515 against the Swiss mercenaries defending Milan. This triumph solidified his reputation as a capable military leader and demonstrated his willingness to take personal risks on the battlefield, a quality that would both inspire and terrify his contemporaries. Yet Francis was not merely a soldier. He was a statesman with an acute awareness of the theatrical nature of kingship. Every gesture, every public appearance, was calculated to project authority, vitality, and charisma. Simultaneously, Francis cultivated a court culture that would become legendary. He invited artists, scholars, and architects to France, effectively importing the Renaissance from Italy to his own country. Leonardo da Vinci, fleeing political turmoil in Florence, arrived in France at Francis's invitation, bringing with him masterpieces such as the Mona Lisa, which would remain in France permanently. Francis's patronage extended to architecture, literature, and music, transforming his court into a center of cultural innovation. But alongside this intellectual vibrancy, Francis was known for his indulgent lifestyle. Extravagance, pleasure, and pursuit of romantic conquest were as much a hallmark of his reign as his political and military achievements. Francis's personal life was intertwined with the politics of marriage and alliances. In 1514, he married Claude of France, the daughter of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany, a union designed to solidify claims and consolidate the French monarchy. Claude was a dutiful and pious woman, but she struggled with the demands of producing heirs while navigating the extravagant and often licentious court her husband presided over. Francis's own romantic pursuits, though unofficial, were relentless. Numerous mistresses are recorded in contemporary accounts, and the king's affairs were well known throughout Europe. These relationships were often politically significant, involving noble families whose influence could be leveraged through proximity to the king. Among Francis's most famous relationships was that with and de Pisseleu, Duchess of Étampes, who became his chief mistress in the 1520s, and wielded significant influence at court, advising the king on matters of state, diplomacy, and cultural patronage. Unlike some of Francis's other romantic entanglements, this relationship was marked by mutual respect and political collaboration. Through and Francis navigated alliances with noble families and foreign courts, balancing personal desire with governance. Yet, Anne's prominence also fueled rivalries, jealousy, and factionalism, characteristic of any Renaissance court where intimacy and influence were intertwined. Francis's reputation as a Playboy king extended beyond France. European ambassadors chronicled his flamboyance, his indulgence in hunting, banquets, and lavish entertainments, and his skill in courtly love. These accounts often mixed admiration with moralistic censure, portraying him as a man who embodied both the vigor and the vices of Renaissance rulership. Francis himself seemed to embrace this image. He understood that kingship was performative. A ruler's persona could strengthen authority as much as armies or law. At the same time, Francis faced the complex realities of international politics. His reign was dominated by the struggle with the Habsburgs, particularly Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The two men were rivals for dominance in Europe, and their conflicts extended from Italy to the Mediterranean, shaping the geopolitical landscape for decades. Francis's military campaigns, including the costly and ultimately unsuccessful Italian wars, demonstrated both his ambition and his limitations. His personal charisma often inspired loyalty among his generals and troops, but could not always compensate for strategic miscalculations. Francis's love for the arts was inseparable from his personal image. He established royal palaces, such as Fontainebleau, as centers of artistic production and intellectual exchange. Artists, architects, and craftsmen from across Europe were invited to contribute to a distinctly French Renaissance style, blending Italian innovation with local tradition. These cultural achievements were part of the king's broader strategy to present France as a sophisticated, powerful, and civilized kingdom, capable of rivaling the might of the Habsburgs and the splendor of the Italian courts. Yet, even as Francis cultivated grandeur, personal tragedy marked his reign. His marriage to Claude produced several children, but many died young, and Claude herself passed away in 1524. The loss affected Francis deeply, though it did not diminish his pursuit of romantic and social pleasures. He continued to surround himself with youthful companions, courtiers, and lovers, creating a court that was simultaneously sophisticated, scandalous, and politically charged. Francis's Playboy reputation was reinforced by his attitude toward his courtiers and foreign diplomats. Ambassadors' reports from France often highlight the king's charm, wit, and ability to disarm suspicion. He combined politeness with strategic insight, using flirtation and courtly behavior as tools of governance. Women at court, noble families, and even foreign dignitaries were drawn into this complex interplay of affection, influence, and manipulation. Francis understood that love and power were not mutually exclusive. Both could be used to cement loyalty and consolidate authority. Despite his indulgences, Francis was a capable ruler who implemented important reforms. He strengthened the central administration, promoted legal codification, and pursued policies to enhance the economic and military power of France. He enacted tax reforms, attempted to standardize justice, and supported exploration, including the early French involvement in the Americas. His court became a hub of intellectual inquiry, attracting humanists and scholars who debated philosophy, science, and the arts. Yet these achievements were inseparable from the spectacle of his personal life. His rule demonstrated that Renaissance kingship demanded both competence and charisma. Francis's relationships with other European powers were equally complex. He alternated between alliance and hostility with Charles V, navigating a landscape of shifting loyalties. Marriages, treaties, and battlefield engagements were intertwined with courtly displays, personal diplomacy, and cultural rivalry. Francis often used his charisma and personal magnetism to forge alliances that formal negotiation could not achieve. His charm, wit, and beauty, he was considered handsome and graceful, were as much a diplomatic tool as his armies or wealth. In the later years of his reign, Francis faced new challenges. The Italian wars continued to drain resources, and his ambitions often outpaced his finances. The Protestant Reformation began reshaping Europe, creating religious tensions that demanded careful management. Internally, the court's extravagance strained the royal treasury and provoked resentment among nobles and commoners alike. Yet Francis remained committed to his vision of a France that embodied the Renaissance ideal, a kingdom where culture, power, and personal charisma coexisted. Francis's personal life continued to attract attention. Even in his 40s, he maintained romantic liaisons and cultivated the image of a vibrant, attractive monarch. Letters, poems, and contemporary accounts describe his relationships with women as both passionate and politically calculated. He understood that the narrative of the king's personal life shaped international perception and reinforced domestic authority. His court became a stage upon which love, desire, and politics were performed simultaneously. His health, however, began to decline in the 1540s. Francis suffered from a series of illnesses, including recurring fevers and injuries sustained from jousting, a sport he never abandoned despite age and risk. His death in 1547 at the age of 52 marked the end of an era. He left behind a France transformed, culturally vibrant, politically ambitious, and internationally prominent. Yet his personal reputation as a Renaissance playboy a lover of arts, beauty, and pleasure, remained a defining element of his legacy. Francis's story is inseparable from the contradictions of the Renaissance itself. He was a warrior and a patron, a king and a lover, a disciplined leader and a man of indulgence. His court reflected the intellectual and artistic ferment of the period, but was also a place of intrigue, desire, and scandal. Contemporary and later historians have often focused on his personal life, sometimes at the expense of his political achievements, but his reign demonstrates how personality could shape governance, diplomacy, and culture in equal measure. The Renaissance demanded more of its rulers than mere administrative skill. Francis embodied the ideal that power was as much about spectacle, charm, and personal magnetism as it was about laws and armies. He understood that the image of a king was a political tool, and he wielded it with skill, creating a court that dazzled both domestic and foreign audiences. His romantic exploits were not merely indulgence. They were part of the machinery of kingship, reinforcing loyalty, shaping alliances, and projecting vitality. Even centuries later, Francis remains emblematic of the Renaissance monarch. His life reflects the blending of personal and political ambition, the intersection of love and power, and the human complexity behind historical achievement. He was a man whose charm and energy captivated his contemporaries, whose court became a center of artistic and intellectual innovation, and whose personal life was as legendary as his military and political endeavors. Francis's legacy endures not only in the monuments he commissioned, the art he collected, or the political maneuvers he executed, but in the image of a king who lived fully, loved freely, and ruled with a combination of ambition, skill, and charisma that defined an age. His story is a testament to the intricate relationship between personality, politics, and culture, revealing the human dimensions of power in a period often remembered for its grandeur, creativity, and passion.